If you've ever visited any online space related to League of Legends, you've probably heard that some champion only has a low win rate because it's popular, and popular champions tend to be played more by inexperienced players who pull the win rate down. In fact, there's a good chance you've used this reasoning yourself, since it's widely accepted as truth in the League communities. However, it isn't true, and in this video I will show you it isn't true. But first, we need to talk about science. The scientific method can be oversimplified as having only two components. The first one is models. A model is anything that describes how something works. Science always tries to find the models that best describe reality. To check how good a model is, we need the second component of the scientific method, data. Data, in its simplest definition, is any measurement of anything. To figure out how wrong a model is, all you have to do is use it to make predictions and then compare those predictions to the data. In scientific contexts, these predictions are called hypotheses. For example, if you wanted to scientifically evaluate whether pigs can fly, you could formulate the hypothesis: pigs can fly, and they don't want to die. So if I throw a pig off a cliff, it will not splat on the ground. Then you could test this hypothesis by yeeting a pig off a cliff. Although it would probably be best to repeat the test a few times, just to be sure. Now, you may be wondering why I went on this rant about the scientific method. And the reason is that when you say Aurelion Sol has a very high win rate, because he has a low pick rate and low pick rate champions are only played by OTPs, you are formulating a hypothesis using a model. The hypothesis is that Aurelion Sol has a high win rate, and the model is that the lower the pick rate of a champion, the more experience the players who play it have, and that more experience leads to a higher win rate. The problem is that for some reason, everybody likes to use the model and make predictions with it, but nobody seems to like to test these predictions against the data. For example, the previous hypothesis about Aurelion Sol is very popular. You've probably seen someone say it at least once, but it's just not true. Aurelion Sol doesn't have a particularly high win rate, and he has not had it since at least his last nerf in patch 11.15, more than a year ago. Back then, Riot Jag was asked why he was nerfing Sol, to which he specifically said that he doesn't have the highest one-trick rate or comparable metric that would suggest his low play rate is a cause. The goal of this video is to explore hypotheses and try to bring this model down from the fantasy land where it currently resides to the harsh depths of reality. First, we need to lay out the model explicitly, so that we can be consistent when using it. This isn't very difficult. The model only has two propositions. The first one is that a champion's popularity is negatively correlated with the experience of the players. And the second one is that the experience of the players is positively correlated with the win rate of the champion. We can test the model in its entirety, but we can also test each of the two parts independently of each other. To test the model as a whole, all we have to do is check whether pick rate is correlated with win rate. So our hypothesis here is champions with lower play rate have higher win rates. To test this, we can gather the win rates and play rates of all the champions and calculate their correlation. And what we find is that it's not just not negative, it's actually slightly positive. High pick rate is correlated with high win rate. But you could argue that this is only because people flock to strong champions, and strong champions have higher win rates, which is a good counterpoint. To adjust for this, we can separate all the regions, and then see within each champion whether the regions where it is more popular are also the regions where it loses more. In order to aggregate the data from all the champions, we can just normalize the data points for each champion and then stack them together. And what we see is that the correlation is even more positive than before. But to be even more careful, let's also break this down by patch. Let's look at the patches between 12.17 and 12.21, normalizing within each region, setting aside all the champions that got either directly changed in one of the patches or which built an item or rune that got changed. For the champions that got changed, the correlation is even more positive. Meanwhile, for the champions that didn't get changed, it's basically zero. This is pretty good evidence for the correlation between win rates and pick rates in general being caused by the player base just having a good read on the meta. But it's important to note that even taking this into account, the correlation doesn't go into the negatives. So it's really clear that the main point of the model is just bad. But this doesn't mean that both of the propositions are wrong, just that the model as a whole is bad. So let's look at each of them individually. The first proposition states that a champion's popularity is negatively correlated with the experience of its players. Back in 2017, writers Nova Asterix and Nancy wrote an article about measuring champion popularity. In it, they introduced the concepts of breadth and depth, breadth being the number of unique players that played the champion, and depth the number of games each player played. If the first proposition of the model we're testing is correct, then breadth and depth for all champions should be very negatively correlated. Well, in that 2017 post, they included a chart of breadth versus depth, and yeah, there doesn't seem to be any noticeable correlation. But we can be more rigorous about this. Lolalytics has breadth and depth data, although unfortunately it's only for all ranks past 7 days. To double up on precaution, let's include another measure. League of Graphs has a stat that measures a percent of the player base that mains each champion, which we can divide by the pick rate to get the percent of players that main the champion. I don't know for sure how League of Graphs measures whether a player mains the champion or not, but this should be correlated with player experience, and therefore with depth as well. Let's include this stat for Plat Plus and for all ranks. Now, if our hypothesis here is correct, then the correlations should look something like this. And if it's wrong, it should look like this. Well, what do they look like? They look like this. The fact that the different depth and breadth measurements are correlated between themselves is good, since it means they're measuring roughly the same things, as we expected them to. However, the lack of consistent correlations between the breadths and the depths disproves the hypothesis. Unpopular champions don't have more experienced players. This is a myth. As a side note, if you've seen this screenshot somewhere, you might be confused, since it's testing the same hypothesis with a seemingly opposite conclusion. The problem in the screenshot is the depth measurement they're using is extremely biased. Lolalytics has a cap on how many players it considers OTPs for every champion, which means that the number of OTP games is extremely deflated for popular champions. If this cap didn't exist, I'd definitely include this stat in the analysis. Okay, so now we know that pick rates and player experience aren't correlated, and that by itself is enough for the model to not match reality, which we also know it doesn't. The only thing we need to check now is whether more player experience increases the overall win rate. This one is actually pretty easy to check. League of Graphs has stats for win rate over previous number of games, and if you check any champ, you'll see a massive win rate increase in the first few games. But after those first few games, the win rates are much more stable, which implies that what impacts the win rate the most is not the OTP rate or the previous number of games played, but rather the noob rate. Unfortunately, we don't have noob rate measurements, so we'll have to make do with the depth measurements from before. There does seem to be a slightly positive correlation between the overall win rate and depth, but it's much smaller than the correlation between win rates at 0 games and the overall win rates. This means that even if the first part of the model wasn't a myth, we still wouldn't be able to outright disregard the win rate of an unpopular champion, since the experience of the players doesn't affect the win rate all that much. It also means that we should generally consider the depth of the champions when comparing win rates, and it seems that the depth on Lolalytics is the most relevant measurement for this, which is convenient since it's displayed on the website directly. Okay, so let's wrap this all up nicely. Lower pick rate doesn't mean higher win rate at all. In fact, it usually means the opposite, but it's not the pick rate that drives the win rate. If anything, it's the other way around. A lower pick rate doesn't mean the players are more experienced with the champion. This is what is really a myth. Players being more experienced does increase the win rate, but not enough to single-handedly explain high or low win rates. And we can have a good idea of the player experience by looking at the depth stat on Lolalytics, although it unfortunately always only shows the last 7 days. See, it took us a while to get here, but I told you I'd show you the model is wrong. Now that you know this, you can do your part in stopping the myth from spreading any further. Having established that pick rates being related to player experience is a myth, I'd like to say why I think it became so widely believed. I think losing a game feels a lot worse than winning feels good. So we get more frustrated at the champs we play against most, because those are the ones against which we lose the most. And we want the champions we're mad at to be OP, because if they're OP, then it's not our fault that we lost. When we look at the stats, that's what we want them to tell us. We want them to tell us we're right, because otherwise we feel like shit. So when we hear something that reinforces our beliefs, it's really easy to go along with it, regardless of whether it matches reality or not. When you get shit stomped by a Katarina, it's a lot easier to say she's OP and her win rate is only low because only noobs play her than it is to admit you played poorly. And it's really hard to then look at her stats and realize she actually has one of the highest depths in the game. Here's my take on this. When you get shit stomped by a champion, it's fine to get ass mad and bitch about the champion being OP. But after you cool off, you should understand that you only said that because you were ass mad. You don't have to stand by your tilted balance takes. It's fine to not be a game design genius when tilted. And you'll save yourself a lot of embarrassment if you avoid posting your tilted takes in a reply to the patch notes on Twitter. Anyway, thanks for watching till the end. At the end of every video, I tell my viewers a secret word to sneak into their comments to let me know they watched till the end. In my last video, I gave you guys an easy one with lettuce. So this time, let's go for a difficult one. Make sure you include the word otolaryngologist in a comment. If you don't know what it means, an otolaryngologist is a doctor that specializes in the nose, ears and throat. Good luck finding a way to fit that into a comment. Speaking of my last video, it seems you guys really liked it. I went from like 200 subs to over 2000, which I wasn't expecting at all. Hopefully you enjoyed this video as much as the last one. I didn't do the editing on this one, which is probably a good thing. It seems you guys were getting tired of all the blurring. If you have any feedback though, please leave it in the comment section. I do read all of the comments. Also, sorry for taking so long with this video. I got a job and the new Path of Exile League dropped, so the time and motivation to work on videos took a big hit. I'll try to get the next video out faster though. Also, if you want to check the stats I used in this video, I'll make sure to leave a link to the spreadsheets in the description of the video, so just check there if you want the stats. With that said, I don't think I have anything else to talk about. So remember to like, subscribe and click the notification bell to catch my next videos. And if you want to see more content like this right now, I'll put up a card on the screen to another video of mine. If you want to bug me about league stats, you can find me on Twitter at JNCLol. Well, and that's everything. See you next time.